And are you ready to proceed?
Yes, Your Honor. Go ahead, Mr. Saab.
Your Honor, just briefly, plaintiffs would like to move into evidence some demonstratives that we used during the direct examination of some of our witnesses, just for demonstrative purposes, not for substantive purposes.
Okay, what are those exhibits?
So the first one is PDX 1-14. That was used during the examination of Representative Harrison. The next is PDX. I'm sorry, we'll
Hold
put
up.
it up. Mhm.
Well, if you could not just put the number, but if you could also identify it for the record, what it is.
Certainly, Your Honor, and we'll just pull that demonstrative up first. This is the chart of overlapping legislators who voted for House Bill 589 in 2013 and Senate Bill 824 in 2018.
Is there any objection to that exhibit being admitted for demonstrative purposes for either defendant?
Not for the legislative defendant, Your Honor.
And none for the state.
Plaintiff's exhibit PDX 1-14 is received.
Thank you, Your Honor. Next is PDX 2, which is the entire set of demonstratives that plaintiffs introduced during their examination of Elizabeth Holmes. And this runs from slides 1 through 16 and includes pictures and videos of Mrs. Holmes, her husband, and her son Jabari. It also includes 2 maps on slides 15 and 16 that show travel distances between the Holmes' house and their election day polling place at East Wake High School, and from their house to the Wake County Board of Elections.
Okay, so we're talking about plaintiff's exhibits PDX 2-1 through PDX 2-16, right?
That's correct, Your Honor.
Any objection to those for the defendants?
Your Honor, this is Nicole Moss again. Those, according to my notes, were actually already admitted on April 12th for demonstrative purposes only. And so we have no objection.
How about for state defendants?
No objection, Your Honor. Thank you.
PDX 2-1 through PDX 2-16, to the extent they haven't already been received in evidence, are received in the evidence for demonstrative purposes.
Thank you, Your Honor. Next is PDX 3, which is a calendar of the legislative actions for Senate Bill 824, and this was a demonstrative used during the examination of plaintiff's expert, Ms. Sabra Fairs.
It shows at the bottom PDX 3-2. You said PDX 3.
Yes, Your Honor. I was referring to the entire presentation, which includes the title page and the demonstrative. So that would be PDX 3-1 and PDX 3-2.
Okay. Any objection to that?
No objection for demonstrative purposes, Your Honor.
No objection, Your Honor.
PDX 3-1 through PDX 3-2 are received in the evidence.
Thank you, Your Honor. And last, I have PDX 5-2 and PDX 5-3. And these were the 2 demonstratives that plaintiffs introduced during their examination of Dr. Ariel White.
Legislative defendants have no objection for them coming in for demonstrative purposes only.
No objection, Your Honor.
PDX 5-2 and PDX 5-3 are received in the evidence for demonstrative purposes.
Thank you, Your Honor. I have no more demonstratives or other exhibits to move for admission.
Thank you. Ms. Riggs, is there further evidence for the plaintiff?
No, Your Honor, at this time, plaintiffs rest their case in chief.
Very well. At the close of the evidence for the plaintiffs, are there any motions for the defendants?
No, Your Honor, there are not, at least for the legislative defendants.
All right, how about for the state defendants?
No, Your Honor. Thank you.
All right, are we ready then to resume the legislative defendants?
Ye-
Case in chief.
Yes, Your Honor, we are prepared to proceed to our case in chief and to resume with the direct testimony of Professor Trey Hood with Ms. Moss running point on that.
Very well. Is Professor Hood, I see him in the lobby. Could we please let him in? Professor Hood, can you hear me okay?
Your Honor?
Yes. Can Professor Hood hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. I see you and I can hear you as well. So are you ready to resume your testimony in this case?
Yes, sir.
All right. I believe that you were being examined by Ms. Moss. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
So Ms. Moss, you may ask your next question.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, Professor Hood. Thank you for your patience this morning. I believe that we left off talking about a study that Professor Lolotis, one of the plaintiff's experts, had cited in his expert report. Do you recall that line of questioning?
Yes.
And I believe, and if we could bring up, Ms. Hardiman, the document that's been marked LX10. And this was the Grimmer and Hirsch article entitled Obstacles to Estimating Voter ID Laws Effect on Turnout. And I believe that you testified that you are familiar with this article.
Yes.
Great. So just to recap where we were at when we were last speaking, what is your understanding regarding what this article has to say about the article cited and relied upon by Professor Lolotis in his expert report regarding voter ID laws' impact on voter turnout?
Well, this is a criticism of that article, the Zoltan article, if you will. And they have a difficulty finding any kind of effects, at least consistent effects, that strict voter identification has caused a disparate racial impact on turnout.
And do you agree with the conclusions reached by the authors of this particular article?
Yes.
And do you agree that the study relied upon by Professor Lolotis deviates substantially from this and other published findings?
Yes. Again, most academic studies have not found any kind of consistent racially disparate impacts from voter ID laws. So from that standpoint, the Zoltan article is over on one side of things, if you will.
Well, Professor Hood, that is actually all of the questions I had for you at this time on my direct examination. And so I'm going to turn you over to the plaintiff's counsel to ask you some questions now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I believe it's Mr. Giller is going to conduct a cross-examination of this witness for plaintiffs. Is that correct, Mr. Giller?
To make sure I'm muted or not muted. That is correct, Your Honor. Can you hear me?
And now, yes, sir. You may proceed with your cross-examination of this witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. Hi, Professor Hood. I don't think we've met. My name is David Giller. How are you doing?
Good morning. I'm fine, thank you. I don't think we've met either.
Well, it's very nice to virtually meet you. So I just have a couple of questions. Professor Hood, in the CV that you attached to your report, you list certain areas of teaching competence. Is that correct?
Yes.
And the areas you list are American politics, behavior and institutions, public policy, and scope methods techniques. Is that right?
Yes,
And you don't list elections administration, correct?
not there. No, it would fall under for me, it would fall under American politics and policy.
Okay. And you also don't list anything titled North Carolina election administration.
No, it's not listed on my CV. No,
And just to confirm, you've never published any academic articles on North Carolina election administration, have you?
that's correct. I've published academic articles on North Carolina politics, but not election administration specifically. So you're right.
Thank you. And you have not taken any formal classes in North Carolina election administration.
Correct.
And you've never observed North Carolina election administration during one-stop early voting. Is that correct?
That would be correct.
And you've never observed North Carolina election administration on election day. Is that right?
That's correct.
And you've never worked as a poll worker in North Carolina, have you?
That is correct.
And you've never attended a conference conducted by the North Carolina State Board of Elections?
Correct.
You've never attended a North Carolina County Board of Elections meeting?
Correct.
And you've never witnessed the determination process with respect to provisional ballots at the county board level in North Carolina, have you?
That would be correct.
And you haven't studied election administration practices across North Carolina's 100 counties, have you?
Not academically, no.
Have you studied them in another form?
Well, I've been involved in other court cases in North Carolina, but not academically, no.
So you're not familiar with the administration practices of North Carolina's 100 counties?
Well, could you clarify a little bit? I mean, I'm a little familiar, I guess you could say.
Well, there are 100 counties in North Carolina, correct?
That is correct.
And they have election administration practices associated with each county. Is that right?
That's correct.
And I was just inquiring, are you familiar with each of the individual practices of North Carolina's 100 counties?
No.
Now, Professor Hood, you state in your report that you were providing an analysis of how North Carolina's voter identification law, passed in December 2018, SB 824, compares to the South Carolina law upon which SB 824 was modeled. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you were asked to provide an analysis concerning whether South Carolina's voter ID statute had a disparate racial impact on voter turnout and what conclusions from that analysis can be applied to the likely effect of SB 824 on voter turnout. Is that right?
Yes.
Just to confirm, you are not offering an opinion on ID possession rates in North Carolina, are you?
No, sir.
And you are not offering any opinions about the racial demographics of voters in North Carolina who possess or do not possess any forms of ID. Is that right?
That's correct.
And you're also not offering an opinion today about North Carolina's or the legislators of North Carolina's intent in passing any bills, including SB 824. Is that right?
That is correct.
And you're not offering an opinion to the extent to which the North and South Carolina electorates need to be similar in order for your conclusion about the effects of SB 824 to hold. Is that right?
Well, I guess I've argued that I think they are similar. I mean, I made that point yesterday.
Did you compare the North Carolina and South Carolina electorates?
No, not directly.
So you're not offering an opinion on whether they are similar if you haven't compared them. Isn't that right?
Well, I know for a fact to some degree they're similar. I've again, I was saying I was more offering a comparison that the two laws under discussion are similar. So you're just talking about the electorates at this point. Is that
Correct. I apologize, Professor Hood. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
I mean, is that, I'm just trying to understand the question.
Correct. So let me just clarify or rephrase. You are not testifying or you're not offering an opinion about the North Carolina or about any similarities between the North Carolina and South Carolina electorates.
I don't discuss that directly, no.
All right, thank you. And you're also not offering a legal opinion on whether SB 824 meets the Arlington Heights factors.
Correct.
And you'd agree with me that whether two laws share certain features is not necessarily predictive of whether a court will allow them to go into effect.
That's certainly true. Different courts are in different states, so there could be a different outcome.
And because you didn't conduct a study of legislative intent, you would agree that whether two laws share certain features is not necessarily indicative of whether the legislatures enacted those laws shared the same intent.
That's correct. I can't opine on legislative intent because I didn't perform that analysis.
Thank you. Good. I would like to show you Table 1 in your report. This is JX 39. Ashley, if you could bring that up. And I think this is page 6. Professor Hood, is this the table from your report of acceptable ID types for the purposes of voting in North Carolina and South Carolina?
Yes.
And this lists the forms of ID that are acceptable under SB 824, is that correct?
Yes.
And there are 12 forms of ID on this list that you identify as being acceptable in North Carolina, is that right?
Yes. There's 12 categories listed, although I guess very technically, some combine different types of ID like a state or local government employee ID, but there's 12 categories. I agree with you.
Sure. Thank you. I just want to go through them briefly just to make sure we're all on the same page. The first one is driver's license. Is that correct?
Yes.
But you don't know how many North Carolina voters lack driver's licenses, do you?
I did not perform that analysis.
And you didn't investigate how many North Carolina voters lack driver's license, did you?
I did not, and I was not asked to perform that analysis.
And the next form is state ID cards. Is that correct?
Correct.
And you don't know how many North Carolina voters have or don't have state ID cards, do you?
I do not.
And you didn't investigate that question either, correct?
Correct.
Next are U.S. passports. Is that right?
Correct.
But you don't know how many North Carolina voters have or don't have a U.S. passport, do you?
That is correct.
And you didn't investigate this question either of how many North Carolina voters do or don't have a U.S. passport.
Correct.
And the next one is military IDs. Is that right?
Yes.
But you do not know how many North Carolina voters have military IDs, do you?
I do not.
And you didn't investigate that question.
Correct.
Next are the free voter ID cards. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. And you don't know how many North Carolina voters have a free voter ID card, do you?
I don't, but it's on that particular category, it's also my understanding that when the law was enjoined, that the state stopped issuing that form of identification. So it's sort of frozen right now, if you will. I don't know the numbers.
But you understood that it is frozen now, and thank you for that clarification, Professor Hood. Did you at any point know how many people had been issued free ID cards?
No, not under SB 824.
Did you know how many people have been issued free ID cards under another law?
Not from memory, certainly.
Is that number in your report somewhere?
No,
And next it says out-of-state driver's licenses are another form of ID. Is that right?
correct.
You don't know how many people with an out-of-state driver's licenses are currently registered to vote in North Carolina.
That's correct.
You never investigated how many people with an out-of-state driver's licenses would be registered to vote or could be in North Carolina.
That is correct.
And the next one's an out-of-state identification card, another potential form of ID. Is that right?
Correct.
But you also don't know how many people with out-of-state ID cards live in North Carolina.
That is correct.
And you didn't investigate that question.
Correct. I wasn't asked to investigate that question.
Professor Hood, isn't it the case that an out-of-state driver's license and an out-of-state ID card are only acceptable if the voter has registered to vote 90 days before the election?
That is correct.
And you never investigated how many voters have an out-of-state driver's license or ID card registered 90 days before the election?
I did not.
And you would agree that an out-of-state driver's license or out-of-state ID card would really only work for the first election in which a voter participated in North Carolina. Is that right?
I think that's fair, yes.
And the next one is public assistance IDs. Is that right?
Correct.
But you have not conducted any research on how many public assistant IDs would be considered acceptable under SB 824, right?
Correct.
And you don't know how many North Carolina voters have public assistance IDs. Is that right?
That is correct.
And the next one is state and local government employee IDs. That's the next form of acceptable ID, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. But in order for a state and local government employee ID to be used, they first have to be approved by the State Board of Elections. Is that right?
Yes.
And you don't know how many state or local government employee IDs have been approved, do you?
I did not.
And you don't know how many voters actually have, regardless, any state or local government employee IDs.
That's correct.
And you didn't investigate that question.
I did not.
Then we have university and college IDs. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And to confirm, university and college IDs also have to be approved by the State Board of Elections in order to be used for voting. Is that right?
Yes.
But you don't know how many university or college IDs have been approved to date, do you?
I do not.
And you don't know how many voters have an approved university or college ID.
I do not.
And you didn't investigate this question.
That's correct.
Going down to tribal IDs. This is also another acceptable form of ID, correct?
Yes.
But you don't know how many North Carolina voters have federal or state tribal IDs.
I do not.
And you did not investigate that question.
I did not investigate that question.
And the last one on this list is Veteran Affairs IDs. Is that right?
Yes.
So you don't know how many North Carolina voters actually have a Veterans Affairs ID, do you?
I do not.
And you didn't investigate that question either. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. Actually, you can bring this down. Professor Hood, you also state in your report that any voter 65 years and older may present an expired form of ID as long as such identification was not expired on their 65th birthday. Is that right?
Yes.
But you have not conducted any study to see how many voters over the age of 65 have IDs that were unexpired when they turned 65 but have since expired. Is that right?
That is correct.
And just to confirm, you haven't conducted any analysis of the racial demographic of North Carolina voters who possess any of the 12 forms of IDs we just discussed. Is that right?
That is correct.
Professor Hood, in your report, you highlight a number of points of mitigation that you claim are designed to mitigate any potential negative effects of SB 824. Is that right?
Yes.
And these are alleged mechanisms in SB 824 that are designed to lessen the impact of the law. Is that right?
In my opinion, yes.
And one of those provisions that you looked at was the free ID program. Is that right?
Yes.
And I think we had said this before, but I guess just to clarify, you don't know how many IDs have actually been issued before being enjoined as part of the free ID program.
I don't know the answer to that question.
And at the time you were writing the report, or did you know whether any IDs had been issued under the free ID program?
I don't remember knowing the answer to that question. No.
Right. And in paragraph 12 of your report, if we just bring that up, that's JX 39. You wrote, registrants, paragraph 12, registrants also can obtain these IDs during the early in-person voting period, which means they can obtain an ID and vote in one trip. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, this is just so I guess I think it was next page. Okay. However, SB 824 only provided for free IDs at county boards of elections offices. Isn't that right?
I believe that's correct. There should be an early voting or a one-stop site in proximate location to the county board, though. So it should be possibly in the same building or contiguous or very close.
But you would agree, just so we're sort of clear, if there was an early voting site that was not nearby or not at the same location as a county board office, there's no guarantee that free IDs would be offered there at an early voting site that is not a county board location.
Correct. So my understanding is it would be possible, but not mandated.
You can bring this down. And Professor Hood, I think you said this earlier, since the law is currently enjoined, as of now, there are no free IDs being provided by the state.
That's my understanding, yes.
Another issue you cite in your report is the provisional ballot process. Is that right?
Yes.
And the use of provisional ballots is mandated by the federal government. Is that correct?
Correct.
So it's not something that was specifically added by SB 824.
No, not in North Carolina. Provisional ballots existed before SB 824 in North Carolina.
Thank you, Professor Hood. Now, in order for a provisional ballot to count, a voter has to return with acceptable ID prior to the vote canvass conducted by the County Board of Elections. Is that right?
That's my understanding.
And this would cure the provisional ballot?
Yes.
And just to confirm, if that doesn't happen, if there's no cure, then the provisional ballot won't be counted.
That's correct.
And you don't know how many people in North Carolina, if any, took the time and effort to cure their provisional ballot.
Well, there are different types of provisional ballots. We haven't had any provisional ballots executed under SB 824. Right.
Well, SB 824 is enjoined, but previously, let's say are you aware of HB 589?
Yes.
And there were provisional ballots that were utilized under HB 589?
There was HB 589, the voter ID requirements were in effect for a single primary election, yes. So the answer to your question is yes, in that primary election.
And in that,
There were provisional ballots issued, yes.
and do you know, Professor Hood, in that primary election with the provisional ballots issued under voter ID law, how many people took the time and effort to cure their provisional ballots?
I don't know the answer to that.
And did you investigate that question?
No, I was not asked to investigate that question.
I think you mentioned this before, but again, just to confirm, you've never actually witnessed the determination process with respect to provisional ballots at the county board level in North Carolina, have you?
That's correct.
And you also don't know how many voters in North Carolina during that one election were offered a provisional ballot, but did not vote. Rephrase that question. You also don't know how many individuals in part of that March election where HB 589 was in effect were offered a provisional ballot, but did not actually vote using that provisional ballot.
I don't know the answer to that question.
And you don't know how many people might have been eligible for a provisional ballot, but weren't offered one.
No, I don't know the answer to that question.
The next issue you discuss is the reasonable impediment declaration. Is that correct?
Correct.
In paragraph 14 of your report, you state that with this provision, no otherwise qualified elector will be denied the ability to cast a ballot in North Carolina because they lack requisite information. Is that the correct line from your report?
Well, it says requisite identification.
I misspoke. Requisite identification. Apologies.
Yes, and that was also the sentence that I updated to say unable to present requisite identification, because it's my understanding that the way that the reasonable impediment declaration in North Carolina would be implemented is not only if someone couldn't obtain an ID, they didn't have an ID and they couldn't obtain one, they could execute that declaration. But if possibly they showed up at the polls and had an ID but didn't have it on them physically, they could also execute a reasonable impediment declaration. I mean, that's my understanding.
Okay, I'm going to ask you about that, and thank you for the clarification. That was actually my next question. Now, you've never conducted a study to audit or determine whether the reasonable impediment option is correctly being offered to voters who are entitled to use it. Is that right?
Well, I guess it depends on how granular you want to get. We did collect data in South Carolina on their reasonable impediment affidavit. I didn't ask that particular question that you're asking, which looks more at sort of county level implementation, I would say, to be fair.
So I just want to sort of clarify. Have you done a study in any state to audit whether the reasonable impediment option is correctly being offered to voters who are entitled to use it?
I think the answer to that's no.
You have not done a study like that?
No.
And so is it accurate to say then that you don't have any information about what percentage of North Carolina voters may not have been offered a reasonable impediment declaration?
Well, are we talking about the HB 589 situation? Because there's nothing that's happened under SB 824, right?
Right. So at the moment, I'm discussing HB 589 for the election that you pointed out where it was in effect.
Okay. The answer to that's no.
So you don't have any information about what percentage of North Carolina voters in that election may not have been offered a reasonable impediment declaration?
That's correct.
And you would agree that if a poll worker fails to offer an otherwise entitled voter a reasonable impediment declaration, that voter's vote won't count?
Well, correct. If a law's, let's say the voter ID law is in place, if SB 824 is in place, and someone shows up without requisite identification, and hypothetically, if the poll worker doesn't offer them that option, they would not be able to cast a ballot. So the poll worker should be trained in that situation to offer them the reasonable impediment declaration option.
Understood, but just to sort of go back, but if the voter was not offered the reasonable impediment declaration, then that voter's vote won't count. That is your testimony, right?
Well, I don't think they could go forward with casting a ballot in that case. So no ballot, no vote, I guess, is what I would say.
Thank you, Professor Hood. And if a voter would filled out a reasonable impediment declaration incorrectly, that vote wouldn't count. Is that right?
Well, can we be a little more specific?
Sure.
How?
Let me ask a different way. Have you reviewed a reasonable impediment declaration before?
I've looked at some, yes.
Have you reviewed the reasonable impediment declarations that would be utilized in North Carolina?
No, I mean, I'm talking about some I saw from South Carolina.
So just so we're sort of clear, you have not reviewed what would be the reasonable impediment declaration in North Carolina?
No.
So if I present or represent that the reasonable impediment declaration in North Carolina has a number of boxes that have to be filled out regarding what the reasonable impediment declaration is, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I've seen the form, yes.
Okay.
Yes, and there are several boxes you can check.
Okay. And you would agree that if some of those boxes were not filled out appropriately, or if the declaration wasn't filled out appropriately, that voter's vote would not count?
Well, this is really technical, I guess. I would say it's my understanding that under SB 824, at least, that unless the declaration is found to be sworn falsely, that it should count and the vote should be converted to a regular ballot. That's my understanding.
Okay. But if the the reasonable impediment declaration wasn't filled out fully, for example, it may not count.
I guess that's possible. I'm going to have to say I just don't know the answer, really, honestly, to that. So,
thank you. And Professor Hood, are you aware that plaintiffs in this litigation, in this case, allege that they were not offered a reasonable impediment declaration and therefore that their votes weren't counted?
I'm aware that some citizens have made that claim, again, under HB 589, since we've had no instance of SB 824 under implementation, right? So under the previous law, yes.
Just to clarify, so you are aware that there are a number of voters who have said that they were not offered a reasonable impediment declaration under the previous voter, under the voter ID law, and therefore those votes weren't counted.
I'm aware of that, yes.
The next issue you highlight in your report is the General Assembly has appropriated funds to facilitate the implementation of SB 824. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. But you haven't conducted any studies to analyze whether the appropriations made by the General Assembly in SB 824 would be sufficient to actually implement the law, have you?
I have not.
And you haven't conducted any study on the relationship between the legislative appropriations and implementation of photo ID in other states, have you?
No, I have not.
You also note, if I recall, that the appropriated funds include $850,000 to be distributed to county election boards. Is that right?
Yes.
But you haven't spoken to any county board officials about whether this funding would be adequate. Is that right?
I've not spoken to any county election officials in North Carolina. That's correct.
And you don't know how the funding appropriated to the county board elect to the county election boards would be divided among the 100 counties in North Carolina. Is that right?
Correct. I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay. And you don't know how the county boards would plan to use whatever appropriation money they might receive. Is that correct?
Correct.
And they might spend it differently.
I guess it's possible. I guess if they receive an appropriation for implementation of a voter ID law, at some level, it should be spent on that particular process. I guess they could spend it on different aspects of that process, if you will.
The specifics might vary.
That's true.
And you write in your report that SB 824 provides for an aggressive voter outreach and education program. Is that right?
Yes, there's a voter outreach and education program in the legislation.
Okay. But you haven't conducted any academic studies on the effects of you have not conducted any academic studies on the effects of voter education efforts, have you?
I have not.
Okay. And you also have not done any studies to determine what constitutes an effective or ineffective voter education effort, have you?
I have not.
And you haven't conducted any academic studies on the effects of voter education efforts?
Not related to voter ID. I have in other areas of election administration.
But not with regards to IDs?
That's correct.
And just to confirm, you haven't conducted any analysis of any voter education efforts that have occurred in North Carolina?
That is true.
You also state in your report that education efforts calls for training of local election officials in order to administer the new ID requirements. Is that right?
That's correct.
But you have not conducted any review of how North Carolina plans to train its poll workers with respect to SB 824. Is that right?
Correct.
And you don't know who will do the training of frontline poll workers in North Carolina?
Not at this time. I don't know. I mean, I guess that remains to be determined, again, depending on whether the injunction's lifted. It could be the State Board of Elections. It could be, a point person at the county level. So there could be different mechanisms. I don't know that anyone really knows the answer to that currently.
And you haven't done any analysis or review to determine what might happen or how the training might progress if the injunction is lifted?
I've not.
And just to sort of confirm, you don't know who trains you don't know who trains the individual officials in each of North Carolina's precincts, do you?
No, not each precinct, no.
And have you spoken to any election officials in North Carolina about what proper training for poll workers under SB 824 would entail?
I have not.
And you haven't reviewed any North Carolina State Board of Elections training modules or manuals, correct?
Correct.
And you have not watched or otherwise reviewed any North Carolina State Board of Elections webinars or videos on poll training?
Correct.
In your report, you state that poll worker training is important to ensure uniform implementation of the law. Is that right?
That is correct.
Let me stop you right there if I can, Mr. Giller. It's 11:45. This is our time to take our second morning break. So we're going to break until 12 o'clock. We'll be in recess until 12 o'clock. Thank you.
Thank you.